afternoon, and I'm Louis Mohn. I want to welcome you to the grand opening of the Mohn Art Gallery within Mohn Custom Interiors here in Springfield, Illinois. I'm very pleased to present the collection of Dr. Wendell Mathews at the grand opening of the permanent art gallery here at Mohn Custom Interiors. Dr. Mathews has had a long and successful career as an art historian, an art collector, a college professor, and a gallery operator, as well as many other successful career events. Dr. Mathews has offered a great opportunity to us here at Mohn Custom Interiors and the surrounding communities by offering a large part of his lifetime collection of important art. The following lecture by Dr. Wendell Mathews, art historian, will cover topics such as styles in art and what determines the monetary value of a work of art. I realize this is not a professional video, however the importance of the information Dr. Mathews will impart will far outweigh this issue. Thank you once again for attending. Welcome to Mohn Art Gallery. Good to go.
Welcome to the Mohn Art Gallery. I'm Wendell Mathews, and I have the collection at the exhibit. And I'd like to make a few introductory comments that will be an introduction to your viewing. And the best way to do it is in two parts, and it's simply done with circles. The first circle represents what you see when you go into a gallery, the work of art. So you have the work of art, and the first thing you see is subject matter. Most people look at subject matter with the idea of identity, and it is figurative, and sometimes we refer to it as representational, sometimes we refer to it as figurative. But it's the imagery, the shapes and the imagery, whether it's a still life, a floral arrangement, whether it's a landscape or seascape, subject matter is what attracts us very greatly. And the second part of it is what most people do not relate to rapidly, and that is the design of it. So we'll be looking at subject matter, but also when you look at a work of art, what is sometimes referred to as the language of art is the design. And design involves the various treatments of the subject and the way it's rendered, so that there are issues of color, of line, of shapes, textures, and perspective and proportion. These are things related to design that render the subject matter, and when you use these in special ways, you develop what is called the style. And it is the style that we will be looking at today. And so I'd like to show you some artwork that represents a variety of styles. The first style is realism. The second one is a kind of idealism. The third is what is called surrealism, from the word sur meaning above and realism, usually the subconscious or the dream world. And then we move into the revolution of the 19th century, Impressionism, and then finally no object, no subject, no figure, non-objective. So looking at the first one, the first one is simply the artist's attempt to render something realistically. And as they do that, we relate to it. It's called July. There is iced tea, summer hat, and the artist has used, through serigraphy or silk screen, over 30 colors to create this. But it has a realism about it, and it is a very popular approach, so that when people look at various aspects of subject matter, they say, oh, I like that, or I know what I like. And so many people relate to this kind of artwork. They like it, they prefer it, and so forth. The second style is what we call idealism. And usually the presidents are depicted in their more idealistic form. This, of course, is Lincoln, as we think of him before the beard, before the presidency. He had just been nominated in 1860, and this photograph was taken by Hessler, who came down from Chicago and took it at the Capitol building. And it's the Lincoln that we think of, the Lincoln almost on the penny, the symbolic Lincoln. And just recently, the Lincoln movie presented him in a little different light that disturbed some people. It wasn't quite the idealized Lincoln that we think of. He was a politician, and he was manipulating as much as he could to get the House to vote for the 13th Amendment. And so he was not really idealized like a lot of people thought of him. But many times, presidents and prestigious people like themselves idealized. There's the story of Lyndon Johnson, who, after his presidency, was to have his presidential portrait. And the first one came through, and I believe it was the one where he had on a Stetson. He was a Texas man, and he had on a Stetson. He disliked it greatly and told him that that would not do, that he was Texan, but he had spent a lifetime in the Capitol building. He had been a congressman. He had been a president, and he wanted to reflect that. So they put the Capitol behind him. He was standing. They put the Capitol behind him, and they put a book in his hand, a book kind of symbolizing intelligence. I am a congressman. I'm a former president. So we idealize ourselves sometimes, and we idealize various people. And this just is a little representation of that. The third style that is often used is called surrealism. And this grows out of it has been with us a long time through the history of art, but Hieronymus Bosch did it years ago in depicting heaven and hell, for example, and all the distortions and so forth. But there are many modern artists that use surrealism, and it's the use of subject matter that emerges out of the subconscious, perhaps the dream world, their personal interpretive world. And this one is especially attractive as a surrealistic work of art. It sometimes is a little much of a problem for people with the skeleton. And I just want to explain it briefly because the artist uses various symbols and various interpretations and various proportions to get across his point. He took his daughter to the Santa Claus village, and in the entranceway there was the sign, "All children must be accompanied by adults." And he read that and he said to his wife, well, can't she just run around and have fun and take a ride and so forth? And well, you've got to be accompanied by an adult. And he got home and he got thinking, when will my child have experiences with reality where an adult can't always be that influential? It's something that that child has to experience on their own. And so he made this. And here she is at Santa Claus Village in one of the little carts taking her through. And the adults, represented in miniature, are relatives pushing her along, moving along with her. But what happens when she has the experience of religion? And her father thought, well, it has to be a very personal thing. I can tell her that I'm a Presbyterian, but does she have to be a Presbyterian? Can't she experience spirituality on her own, and if she wants to be a Presbyterian, fine, but if she doesn't, fine. And so she will experience religion and the devil, who is depicted over here, and some of the symbolism that goes along with Christianity and the church. A priest down here carrying a light into the world. He wanted her to be an artist. He thought she was very talented, and he wanted to help her become an artist. This is his symbol. He always shows himself with a top hat, and the butterfly effect is innovation, creativity, the artist. Well, she didn't want to be an artist, and she loved music. And so here he has her now playing her violin, and she is saying, "Daddy, I know you wanted to accompany me as an adult, but I want to be a musician." Now, the skeleton is a symbol that he uses that represents death. Her grandmother died, and after her death, the child had a great difficulty accepting that, and so she wept. He said, "I think she wept for 2 weeks, missing her grandmother." So he put in the skeleton, yes, representing the death, but a light in the darkness, and the whole symbolism of light in darkness. And the priest has a candle, light in darkness. So you get the idea of religion and light, death and light, and then to accent it even more, he represents the resurrection through the rooster, which has always been a symbol throughout Christianity of the cock crowing and the resurrection, the new dawn, the new morning. So here is a surrealist who has distorted his proportions, who has used 22 colors to create 4 plates and 22 colors in order to create this work. And it's the style of surrealism. The next style is one that came as a part of the revolution in the 19th century. There were various revolutions. Right now in Springfield, they are putting on Les Mis, the revolution, the French Revolution. We had our own in the sense of the Civil War. But this revolution was within art, and it was a revolution where Monet was especially influential, but many followed him. And it was where the artist decided to change tradition. The tradition had been what was called neoclassical, and it grew out of the Napoleonic period, and the Academy dominated with idealism of Napoleon and his victories and so forth. And it also had a very controlled kind of art, and it was all done in the studio. And so they were darker paintings. So. Well, the Impressionists decided to go outdoors, and they went outdoors and they started painting the landscapes and people in landscapes, or they went to various street affairs and cafes, and they would paint these people, these more common subjects in that light. And they used a technique of brush strokes that left a soft edge, a diffused, what we call a diffused edge. And then they not only used the brush strokes, but they would interlock brush strokes of let's say, blue and yellow. And when you moved away, the eye blended and it turned green. And they loved this optic effect because they felt it was such a part of art. And that revolution led then to many artists carrying on that tradition of emphasizing not subject matter. It was there, but it was an emphasis, a new emphasis on the design elements that we talked about, the use of the color and the use of the texture and the use of the softening of the surfaces and so forth. This is a later work. He was born in the late 1800s, and he worked around Picasso, and he was pictured with Picasso. It's a landscape, and it's Provence, where Cézanne worked. And Moulet has now created, with trees and with color, a landscape. But is it really a realistic landscape? Is it a real strong figurative landscape? No. He He's not interested in the mountains of Provence and so forth. They're there, but they're not a literal kind of depiction. And so he has used a palette of warm and cool, which the Impressionists loved. Theirs were softer. The blues were softer, and the warm colors were usually softer. But he has interplayed then the complementarity, as we call it, of the warm colors and the cool colors. And so your cool colors being your blue and your purples and your greens and so forth. And then, of course, your warm colors in the warm palette of red, yellow, and orange. And a lot of people that have visited the exhibit like this very much. And in a survey about 20 years ago of gallery viewers, gallery visitors, they were asked what styles in the whole gallery, like the Art Institute of Chicago, what style would you prefer if you were to buy one or have one? And it was Impressionism that, and a more abstract emphasis on design that became very popular. And it surprised a lot of people. We're talking gallery goers, so they had some experience with art perhaps, but they preferred Impressionism. So you get into then this type of approach. Now, it's not a great step to the last type of style, and that is where the artist finally said, the elements and principles of design, with all that's involved in color and perspective and all, the flattening of the surface, this is more important than subject matter. And so they started producing what is called non-objective art, where there is no subject matter, and it's not good to try to read into it. I was in a gallery recently, and an artist had 4 large panels, about 4 feet each, and they went down the wall, and they moved from blue and blue-green, and then it started getting warmer, and finally at the end it was the oranges and the reds and all. And the woman was walking up and down looking at it, and finally she said, well, I know that's a flower. Well, I didn't have the heart to tell her my opinion, but I thought I'll just let her think it's a flower. But it wasn't. It was just a transition of color, and the artist playing with the various colors. Jackson Pollock did it with lines, where he started the stringy lines that he made, and a lot of people were just utterly confused. I remember I was very unhappy with a textbook that I had to use, in which the author said, oh, but it's not just lines. This is symbolic of man's journey into society, and all of these are trails of man emerging into society. Jackson Pollock would have rolled over in his grave if he heard that. I mean, he wasn't interested in that at all. He was interested in setting up a webwork of color in a little different manner, in a little different fashion. And because he was innovative, he's been highly praised, and his work hangs in major, major museums. Well, this artist is California, and what has he done? A lot softer, more in the impressionistic way, but he has used the warm palette of yellow and reddish and then towards orange, pink. And then the complementary colors of the warm colors is the blue. The Impressionists loved that. They would make their blue and pink of sorts. But he has just done it without figures. He has tried to set up a composition where this interest, visual interest, is offset by this, so that you have a yin-yang, a kind of complementarity of polarities. And a lot of people look at it and they can't see any figures in it, and they can't really understand why an artist would simplify it such. It's in a movement in the art world of minimal art, and represents that style non-objective. And you'll see a number of those in the exhibit. In order to talk then about the combination, we would like to just show 3 landscapes, and this will help to indicate the style that artists can use. This is by the Chicago artist Louis Rittman, and it is painted in France. It's called French Village. Pathway goes down. He did a series of these, of pathways going down into little villages. And he's used pencil and ink, and then he's brought in the watercolor, and has created a landscape that's rather figurative and very recognizable, and I've always liked it. It's more figurative, but what I like about it is that he used an expressionistic brushstroke, expressionism in the sense of a loose, more direct painting kind of thing. It's darker than the Impressionists, and yet it creates a depth, and it creates a spontaneity about it that is very good. The next landscape would be, I have it right over here, would be this one that we have seen. But here you have a landscape, trees and hills and foreground, background, clouds. But now the artist has used that abstraction, and the word abstract simply means to start with a figure and then pare away from it, pare away. Not objective. There are writers, even art historians, who misuse the word abstract. They talk about pure abstraction and so forth. Abstract simply means you start with subject matter and you pare it down. You still recognize it. And this is why Picasso was probably voted by the art community as being the greatest artist of the 20th century. He kept figures, always, but he abstracted, and for the sake of design, for color, shapes, and so forth. The third landscape is more controlled, and yet it's abstracted. This is by Carol Summers, California artist, and I've always admired his work very much. It's done very simply by his forming wooden blocks and putting them down and coloring them and printing them, and then taking other blocks and putting them in a little jig, and then he uses an atomizer or a spray, and he sprays them so that they diffuse and they soften. Dreisbach, who did the All Children, invited him to come to the university, Northern University, and demonstrate his technique. At that time, he was using a little mouth spray, and he would put this alcohol in and use his mouth to spray these things. Later on, Dreisbach told me that he of course used a real spray gun, and I have one of his works that's very large, and I can understand why he would go to a spray gun. But here's a landscape with a rainbow, and it's hills and mountains and so forth, but highly, highly stylized. And this differs from the Moulet in the sense that it is more geometric. Now, some artists like a little more control of the geometric, and some like the more expressive. And throughout art history, we have had that kind of treatment of subject matter. For a matter of fact, back in the neoclassical period, they used very tight kind of line work and very controlled. The reaction against that was called Romanticism, where Delacroix would paint with brush strokes, and it drove the Academy crazy because they thought that you shouldn't show brush strokes, but he did. And the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche looked at this during his time, and he said, well, what's really represented is 2 points of view. The one point of view we will call controlled, and we'll use the Greek word for Apollo, and we'll call it Apollonian. And it's a more controlled kind of treatment of subject matter. And over here we'll call this one after the god of wine, Bacchus, but Dionysius, and we'll call it Dionysian. And so the more expressionistic art is usually referred to that. So you have two possibilities. You have a more expressionistic kind of thing, and then you have a more controlled. And those set up styles within. So this gives you a kind of overview of some of the things in the gallery that can illustrate these various approaches in both subject matter and design and creation of a style by the artist. And the artists are praised when they are innovative, when they bring something new, when Monet brought something new. Now, he wasn't appreciated in his day, later in his day, but in the early period, there were people in the academy that hated this sketchy approach, this impressionistic approach. They went to one of the exhibits, and one of the critics just took his umbrella and poked a hole in one of them, saying, "That's not a painting. That's not even a sketch. It's I don't know what it is, but I don't like it." Boom. So, the critics slowly have evaluated the various styles, the innovations on the part of artists. And these artists then are praised for their innovation within the context of the historic context of art. And as they are evaluated, and as the connoisseurs and the museum curators and the art dealers and the brokers, as they look at this art and they think that it's innovative and important, and bring it into the galleries and start selling it, and collectors start collecting it, it goes up in value. It is sad that someone like Van Gogh couldn't sell one of his paintings in his lifetime. His brother Theo worked in Paris at a gallery, and he couldn't sell them. And yet, 25 years ago or so, the Japanese merchant who had a huge department store bought one of the Van Goghs for $52 million to place in front of, at the entranceway of his place. What happens in this world of innovation and this world of critiquing and learning the language? Well, a good example is Andy Warhol. And I've had some experiences with the Warhols. I bought one to show students. It was one that was brought from New York when Warhol was a relatively unknown, and it was depicting in the 1960s when President Kennedy was killed. It depicted Jacqueline Kennedy in her black hat and veil and dress, and Warhol took it out of the newspaper, which broke it up into dots, and simply silk screened it. And so he had on a blue background Jacqueline Kennedy. The one I purchased had 4 from newspapers. And later on, I bought it for $200. I showed it to my students. I explained to them what a serograph was, and I explained to them who Warhol was, although he was in one of the paperbacks that I was required reading. Later on at Sotheby's International Auction House in New York, not all that much later, it sold for $9,600. So here was a young artist who just started being accepted and representing a certain style. What did he do? Well, he said, why can't we use popular images and popular figures instead of, fancy little still lifes and so forth? And so he did Campbell soups, as you know. He did Brillo boxes as sculpture. And then he started doing popular images with silk screen. He did Marilyn Monroe in many forms as far as arrangements and compositions. He did Elvis Presley. He did John Wayne. He did Jagger. He did a whole series of pop images, pop artists in the world of culture. At first he was criticized, but in time he was well received, not just in the public, but by the critics. And now his work is represented in Pittsburgh in a museum dedicated to him after he passed away. The largest museum for any one artist in the world, Andy Warhol. I bought 4 of his works in Chicago through an ad in the Tribune. Paid $300 each for them, 20 years ago or so. Later, now just recently, my son took him to Pawn Stars, and Rick argued with him about it. He brought his expert in, and finally, yes, they are Warhols. Yes, what are they worth? And finally, Rick was willing to pay $27,000 for something I paid $1,200. So art grows in value, monetary value. And as these people get accepted in the art community, and they get into exhibitions, and they get into museums such as the Museum of Modern Art, the Museum at the Art Institute, the Whitney, the Guggenheim, many of these great museums, it shows that they have been accepted in this world of art, in the critics. And so their value goes up. And especially when Warhol died and Jackson Pollock died early, when this happens, they aren't making them anymore. And so their value goes up even more, often. And so when you look at some of these works of art, we have put on a little sign the various museums and the exhibits and their record as an artist in the art world. We haven't had bios. We have folders on that, and we can tell you about the artist and something on his life. But primarily, we've emphasized art as an investment. And so, in this little pamphlet that I've written, there is the diagram of the circles in the art. There's also information in here about buying art as pleasure, something I like, but remembering the statement by the art historian Jansen, it's nice to say, I know what I like, but also say, I like what I know, and the more you gain experience, the more you know, perhaps you might change. So this little pamphlet explains most of what I've said, and will help you and give you diagrams on the various forms of printmaking.
We can edit this out. Or whatever you like.
Well, I'm Dr. Wendell Mathews, and
You can't read my writing.
and I can't read this right. No, I'm Wendell Mathews, and these works of art that we've used as illustrations are just a small portion of the total exhibit that's at the Mohn Art Gallery here in Springfield. So we invite you to come and look and see and ask questions and receive one of these brochures and my compliments, and enjoy your visit. Okay. Does it make sense?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, great.
All right, Laura. Thank you.
Excellent.